I never expected the ground beneath my house to roar like a living creature, but on that night, it did. The sound wasn't thunder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the hill itself ripping open, groaning like metal under pressure, as thousands of tons of soaked earth began sliding toward the valley below. And as I watched the slope explode into a river of mud and broken foundations, one thought sliced through the chaos louder than the sirens and screaming wind: I warned them. I warned the HOA this would happen, and now they're blaming me for it. From the beginning, the land behind my property wasn't just dirt. It was old hillside, dense, layered, unpredictable. My father used to say the hill remembered every storm, every dry season, every careless cut made by someone who thought money could outrun gravity. When the HOA bought the neighboring parcel and announced plans for a luxury terrace expansion, I didn't celebrate like everyone else. I walked the ridge, studied the fractures in the rock, and felt the soil crumble under my boots. I knew something was wrong. I showed them maps. I printed geological surveys. I paid out of my own pocket for an independent engineer to inspect the slope. His verdict was chilling: the hill was stable only if left untouched. Excavating it, flattening it, or building weight onto it would load stress where the earth was weakest. It wasn't speculation. It was physics. It was history. It was a warning. But the HOA didn't hear a warning. They heard an obstacle. They called me dramatic, negative, difficult. One board member laughed during the meeting and said, if the hill wanted to move, it would have done it years ago. Another shrugged and told me to stop fear-mongering because investors were already lined up. When I refused permission to extend their retaining wall onto my land, they rewrote the story. Suddenly I was uncooperative, hostile, and trying to sabotage community development. Still, I stood my ground, literally. The day construction crews cut into the slope, my stomach dropped. Heavy machinery carved deep scars into the hillside. Soil piled up like wounded skin. I filmed everything: every trench, every exposed seam, every careless trench drain. I wasn't trying to win a fight. I was trying to save lives, homes, and the land itself. But 2 months later, after the storm rolled in and the hill finally broke loose, the HOA didn't admit they were wrong. They said the landslide was my fault. The morning after the hill fell, I stood in the mud-soaked silence while flashlights sliced across broken decks, twisted pipes, and walls that looked as if they'd been peeled away by giant hands. The wind still carried the smell of rain and raw earth, yet the HOA president didn't see devastation, he saw opportunity. He marched toward me, code plastered to his shoulders, and said with a voice that cut through the sirens, "This is on you." I remember blinking, convinced I'd misheard. But behind him, board members nodded, whispering to responders and pointing at my property line. They claimed that because I refused to grant access for their retaining wall, water had pooled, pressure had built, and the slope had finally given way. Their story spread faster than the mud. Neighbors who once waved from their porches avoided my eyes. One woman asked if my stubbornness had cost families their homes. The shame they tried to hang on me felt heavier than the debris. Yet beneath the guilt trap, anger burned. I'd documented every trench, every scar, every shortcut taken in defiance of engineering reports. Their project hadn't failed because I resisted, it failed because they carved a wound into a living hillside. That afternoon, insurance adjusters, city inspectors, and attorneys filled the cul-de-sac. The HOA presented a packet thick as a phone book, framing me as the obstruction who prevented safety upgrades. Pages of emails were cherry-picked, whole sentences I'd written about slope integrity were reduced to fragments that sounded hostile. My engineer's report, the one warning them not to excavate, was dismissed as speculative. A consultant they hired blamed unmanaged runoff from my hillside, even though the storm drains they installed were already clogged with gravel. Standing there, drenched and exhausted, I realized the landslide wasn't the disaster, the narrative war that followed was. So I opened my folder, laid out photos, timestamps, and permits, and spoke with a calm I didn't feel. I told them about the fractures I'd mapped, the warning signs they mocked, the week they ignored weather forecasts and rushed to pour concrete. Every word was a line in the truth I refused to surrender. But as the sun sank behind the wreckage, the HOA's attorney quietly delivered the next blow. They were preparing a lawsuit seeking $10 million in damages, and I was their prime target. I didn't flinch, fear would only feed their story. Instead, I promised myself that if they wanted a fight, they'd have to face every buried fact, every silenced witness, and every decision they'd made to gamble with a mountain. The storm had moved the earth, but what came next would shake their story even harder. Confirm if you want to continue to Chapter 3. Continue. I called Chapter 3 the paper trail they tried to bury because every step forward felt like digging through dirt as heavy as the hillside itself. After the lawsuit threat, I retreated home and turned my dining room into a war room, spreading folders across the table until the paperwork looked like a topographic map of decisions and consequences. Emails, survey notes, invoices, inspection photos, every scrap of proof waited to be assembled into a single story. I traced dates with a pen, circling the week they rushed excavation before the storms, underlining the engineer's warning they dismissed as speculative. I found a purchase order for cheaper drain piping, placed the same day their contractor requested reinforcement. There were signatures from board members who swore they never saw concerns, yet my emails sat right beneath their replies. The truth wasn't hiding, it was buried under convenience. When my attorney arrived, she listened quietly as I walked her through the timeline. Her expression hardened at the photos of open trenches beside exposed fractures, and at the memo where a board member wrote, "Proceed delays cost more than risk." She said the HOA wasn't just shifting blame, they were rewriting cause and effect. If we stayed silent, their version would harden like wet concrete. That night, I drove back to the shattered hillside with a notebook and flashlight. The mud was cold, but the evidence was still alive, drain outlets choked with gravel, concrete seams split like fault lines, and rebar protruding where corners had been rushed. I wrote measurements, marked coordinates, and promised the hill I would not let its story be silenced. This wasn't vengeance, it was preservation of truth, of responsibility, of every voice they tried to erase. By the time dawn colored the clouds, I had built a record stronger than rumor, and for the first time since the slide, I felt the ground steady beneath me. But victory wouldn't come from truth alone, it would come from shining it where they least expected. The board had relied on shadows, confident neighbors would believe the loudest voice, not the most accurate one. So I prepared a presentation, not for the courtroom yet, but for the community, the very people they had turned against me. Every slide would carry evidence, every timestamp a decision, every photograph a moment when disaster could have been prevented if someone had simply listened. I wasn't seeking sympathy, I was seeking daylight, because daylight leaves no room for convenient myths, and I knew once the truth was seen, the hillside would finally speak for itself. And the HOA finally sensed their silence was ending for good. The meeting I was never supposed to win began with folding chairs, damp jackets, and the uneasy hush of neighbors who had heard a single version of events for far too long. I stood at the front of the hall, a projector humming behind me, the scent of coffee drifting through air that felt charged with suspicion. The HOA board sat in a hard row, arms crossed, already rehearsing their objections. I didn't raise my voice, I simply pressed play. The first slide showed the hillside before a single trench had been carved, green and patient, older than our neighborhood. Then came timelines, emails, weather reports, and photographs of fractures opened by steel teeth. I spoke quietly, letting the evidence do what my warnings never could, it made the hill speak for itself. A neighbor in the second row covered her mouth when she saw the memo reading "Proceed, delays cost more than risk." Another whispered that she remembered the day trucks idled through the storm. The room shifted, not toward pity, but toward recognition, like a lock turning because the right key had finally been found. The president tried to interrupt, insisting their consultant blamed my land, yet the next slide revealed clogged drains and unsupported cuts above their own footings. My voice did not shake. I told them I wasn't asking for sympathy, I was asking for accountability, not to punish anyone, but to prevent another night like the one we could never forget. When the projector clicked to black, silence spread across the hall. Then applause rose, hesitant at first, then steady, like rain finding rhythm. Neighbors turned toward the board, and the story they had trusted began to crumble faster than the hillside ever had. For the first time, I felt the ground hold beneath my feet, not because the danger was gone, but because the truth was finally standing with me. Yet victory was fragile. After the meeting, the attorney approached, his smile practiced and distant. He said public opinion meant nothing in court, and the claim for damages would continue unless I accepted a quiet settlement that pinned partial blame on me. His words felt like another crack in the slope, subtle but dangerous, reminding me that the battle had only shifted terrain. I thanked him, refused, and walked outside into the cool evening air, knowing the next fight would not be waged in a hall, but in a courtroom where every word carried weight heavier than stone. Still, I carried something stronger than fear, a community that had finally seen the mountain's truth and understood why I never stopped speaking, even when the ground itself seemed determined to silence me. That resolve. The courtroom storm no one planned for began the morning our case moved from neighborhood rumor to formal record. I walked past marble walls that echoed with footsteps, carrying a folder thick with photographs, reports, and the quiet certainty that truth deserved a chance to breathe. The HOA's lawyers arrived with rolling briefcases and confident smiles, speaking as though gravity itself answered to their arguments. They said the disaster was predictable only because I refused to cooperate, turning caution into villainy and erasing every warning I had ever given. My attorney rose with calm resolve and unfolded the story the hillside could not tell for itself. She showed timelines of rushed excavation, invoices for cheaper materials, and emails in which board members gambled risk against profit. Each photograph felt like a heartbeat. When the engineer's report appeared on the screen, the room leaned forward, as if weather could be rewound by comprehension alone. I listened to testimony from neighbors who remembered engines groaning through rain, and from a contractor who quietly admitted he was ordered to finish before the storm arrived. With every sentence, the narrative shifted like clouds breaking open. Still, the HOA pressed harder, suggesting that my boundary line had trapped water and turned caution into negligence. I felt fear knock at my ribs, but I refused to shrink. I spoke of my father's lessons about old hillsides, of fractures mapped months before a single truck arrived, and of the choice they made to cut the slope open anyway. The judge listened without expression, yet something steadied inside me. Whatever verdict waited ahead, I was no longer standing alone. Community members sat behind me, hands folded, eyes bright with conviction, and their presence felt like bedrock beneath uncertain ground. When proceedings recessed for the day, the hallway hummed with whispers, but my heart was quiet. I knew the fight was not over, yet the truth now lived in official light, impossible to bury again. Whatever came next would reveal who we really were, and whether justice could hold as firmly as stone. That night I walked past the darkened ridge, listening to winds sweep across the scarred hillside, and I whispered a promise into the cold air: I would see this through, not for revenge, but for every family who slept uneasily whenever rain touched the ground. The mountain deserved guardianship, not greed, and if accountability required patience, then patience would become my strongest weapon. The storm had changed the land, yet it changed me, carving courage where doubt once lived, and reminding me that some battles are not chosen, they arrive with the rain, demanding that someone stand firm until the truth settles here. When the rain returned, the city felt like it was holding its breath. Forecasts warned of another atmospheric river, and every headline treated the hillside like a ticking clock. I walked the perimeter with inspectors, listening to radios crackle as crews monitored drainage channels and temporary barriers. The scars from the slide were still raw, patched with tarps and steel mesh, Yet the HOA insisted the danger had passed, that nature had simply chosen the wrong slope at the wrong time. I knew better. Water remembers every weakness. The engineer and I mapped seepage lines across the cut face, tracing silver threads that whispered through stone. He said the ground was carrying weight it never agreed to hold, and that any new storm would test the truth harder than any courtroom. His words didn't frighten me, they clarified the stakes. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed the board meetings, the smirks, the signatures, the confidence that money could convince a mountain to behave. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the ridge, and with each distant echo I felt resolve form like bedrock inside my chest. If the hill moved again, the world would finally see what negligence looked like in motion. By dawn the storm arrived. Rain drilled the tarps, wind howled through leaning fences, and the valley turned to mist. Emergency crews staged trucks at the base road while cameras blinked from news vans along the curb. The HOA president appeared with an umbrella and a polished statement about resilience, but the hillside answered before he could finish. A jagged rumble traveled through the ground, deep and hollow, like a warning spoken from the earth's throat. Chunks of fill slid from the cut, racing down the slope in a muddy braid. It wasn't catastrophic not yet, but it revealed the truth more clearly than any exhibit. The runoff flowed straight from their excavation seams, bypassing every drain they swore would protect the neighborhood. Inspectors filmed in stunned silence. The president lowered his umbrella. No homes were lost that morning, only illusions. The storm had become a witness, and for the first time the narrative broke free of their script. I stood there soaked to the spine, not triumphant, not vengeful, only steady because the land had spoken again, and this time the world was listening. And as reporters gathered near the barricades, I realized the narrative had shifted forever. The hill was no longer a rumor or a scapegoat, but a witness etched in mud and memory, promising that the next chapter would carry consequences no boardroom could outrun. I knew the fight was far from over, but the truth finally had momentum behind every raindrop. The offer that wasn't really help began the morning after the hillside tremor, when the HOA invited us into mediation and promised resolution instead of war. The conference room smelled like paper and wet carpet, and every smile across the table looked rehearsed. They spoke of community, closure, and moving forward, yet none of those words felt anchored to reality. Their offer arrived as a stack of clauses: I would accept partial responsibility, withdraw my engineer's findings, and agree never to challenge their decisions again. In return, they would reduce the damages and call the disaster unforeseeable. It sounded generous until you read the fine print, where truth dissolved into silence. My attorney asked them one question: why erase the warnings if they were irrelevant? The president shifted, fingers tapping the table like distant rain. Because, he said, precedent was dangerous. If fault could be traced to negligence, future projects might stall, and investors might reconsider. In that sentence, the hillside finally spoke without mud or thunder. Profit had always been the loudest voice in the room. I declined. Not with anger, but with clarity. I told them the land deserved honesty, that families deserved safety, and that no settlement should require us to bury evidence. The mediator sighed, sensing the distance no signature could bridge. Outside, clouds lifted, and pale sunlight touched the scarred ridge like a promise made by patience. Word spread through the neighborhood that I had refused to bend. People stopped me on the street to say they finally understood what the fight meant: not revenge, but stewardship. And for the first time, the HOA realized their story no longer controlled the ground beneath our feet. The road ahead remained uncertain, yet my resolve felt calm and immovable, like bedrock waiting for justice to settle. I knew the trial would return, louder than before, but the truth now carried witnesses, documents, and the hillside's silent memory. Whatever they offered next would be weighed against that memory, and I would not trade it away. That evening I walked the ridge again, listening to wind move through fractured grass. I thought of every meeting, every shrug, every laugh that tried to belittle caution, and I understood something simple: courage is just persistence that refuses to erode. The land beneath my boots did not tremble. It waited, patient and resolute, as though it trusted me to carry its story forward. And I promised I would, no matter how long the path to accountability became. Because some truths are heavier than mud, and letting them sink would only invite another fall. So I kept walking with steady steps, ready for the final reckoning the mountain still demanded ahead. When truth finally echoed beyond the valley began on the morning the judge reopened discovery, allowing every photo, memo, and rainfall log into the record. Word traveled fast. Reporters returned, not for spectacle, but for answers the hillside had been whispering since the first stone shifted. I felt the weight of months lift as technicians scanned the slope with ground-penetrating radar, tracing hidden voids left by rushed excavation. The images glowed across a screen like an X-ray of negligence, revealing pockets of water and fractured seams precisely where my engineer had warned. Neighbors gathered at the perimeter fence, quiet, attentive, no longer divided by rumor. A retired geologist stepped forward to offer context, explaining how the cut had severed ancient drainage veins and pushed stress toward my boundary line. His testimony wasn't emotional, it was surgical, patient, undeniable. The HOA's consultant tried to pivot, blaming weather again, but the storm graphs on the monitor told a different story: rainfall within historical range, failure far outside it. That afternoon, the board president's confidence faded into careful silence. For the first time, he looked at the hill rather than the cameras. I almost pitied him, because I could see the moment he realized the narrative had escaped his grasp. Responsibility didn't roar or accuse, it simply stood there in data and dirt, impossible to outrun. Still, accountability isn't a single moment, it is a corridor. We walked it step by step as the court ordered an independent review, and the reviewers confirmed the chain of decisions that loaded the slope like a ticking weight. They called the disaster preventable. The word rang through the room like a bell. I did not celebrate. I breathed, slowly, while memories of the night of the slide returned: the sirens, the wind, the feeling of ground becoming water. I remembered why I had fought, not to win, but to keep another family from waking to that sound. As dusk fell, I stood along the ridge with neighbors beside me. The scarred hillside glowed bronze in the setting light, no longer an accusation, simply a teacher. We spoke quietly about rebuilding with restraint, about stewardship instead of expansion, about letting the land rest. Yet I knew accountability would not erase loss, it would only guide what came next. We urged the city to reshape future projects with patience, to listen to the ground before charts or budgets. The hill had spoken, and now our duty was to learn its language so future caution could replace careless confidence everywhere. The verdict the mountain waited for unfolded beneath skylights washed in pale morning light, the kind that makes every word feel heavier than sound. I sat at the same table where, months earlier, I'd been painted as the villain, the obstacle, the neighbor who refused to cooperate. Behind me, the community filled the benches, not angry, not triumphant, simply ready to hear the truth spoken without distortion. The judge lifted the decision, and the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was listening. The ruling was clear. The hillside was altered without sufficient stabilization. Warnings were ignored. Timelines were rushed against professional advice. The failure was not an act of fate or weather or stubbornness, it was preventable. The word echoed like distant thunder across the room, not loud, but undeniable. The HOA was ordered to assume responsibility, fund remediation, and participate in long-term slope stewardship with independent oversight. My name was cleared completely. I didn't smile. I closed my eyes and let the relief arrive like steady rain after drought. The board president stared at the table, no speeches, no spin, only the quiet realization that truth had outlasted every narrative they tried to build across fractured ground. When we stepped outside, the ridge rose in the distance, scarred but patient, and for the first time since the night the hill moved, I felt the world align with it again. Neighbors came forward not with congratulations, but with gratitude for standing, for persisting, for refusing to let the story be buried under paperwork and blame. I told them what I had always believed: the fight was never about winning. It was about listening to engineers, to evidence, to the land beneath our foundations. Accountability was not a punishment, it was a promise to do better. Weeks later, crews returned to the slope not to carve or rush or force it into profit, but to heal it. Drainage veins were restored, terraces softened, native roots stitched into tired soil. The hillside didn't roar anymore. It breathed. And every time I walk that ridge at dusk, I remember the first warning I ever spoke, the one they tried to silence, and I understand the lesson carved into stone and memory: when we honor the ground, it holds us. When we ignore it, it reminds us.